Okay,
Share.
so um, taking a look at the action items, most of the things seem done. You might want to have a follow-up meeting on the line assembly. Um, Nico spoke to Varco and the poster commands. I still haven't done anything about the floating point stuff. With respect to the pattern, different binding modes in patterns, by move and by ref. I have a PR up by the way, Matthew. You guys in that? Um, and I forget what the thing about design meeting schedule on inside. Oh, it's just the upcoming,
I tried to
right?
announce it. Um, the
Okay,
question would be, yeah, I think we'll stick with this schedule, but I do,
seems good.
yeah. All right.
Yeah,
Um,
makes sense. Moving on to the Shepherd items. So, uh, well, as I said, you might want to have a meeting at a different time about inline assembly. Uh,
right. Well, that's the only question then. Do we want to consider replacing, for example, one of these meetings like specialization infomercial?
I don't think in my view, those are higher priority, and those have been waiting a long time.
I'm aware that's your view. But there is like a, I guess the question is, let's start with a smaller group to discuss this perhaps, but I think there's a general question around our policies here that we should discuss. Um,
Okay. Safe transmute. I think there were no updates for Contival. Another peer was merged. We're making some progress on the opt-out thing. The question mark const traits feature. The second one is the new PR. With respect to Amplify Unwind, I think there were no new updates.
no, this should,
When it comes to dying traits, we're still working on the creator stuff, it seems.
yeah, but there is a question mark here. I'm currently, the current PR is not exactly doing the things I said. It is something slightly different. It is making DIN trait not DIN safe if there is a DIN overlapping impl and the trait has associated types. And I believe this will have very little to zero impact, though I haven't got a create a run showing that yet because of bugs. um, it is a relatively narrow change and doesn't, I mean, it's still the case that those items are implicitly default. So the thing I talked, all the stuff we talked about is still true. And I think if we want to correctly handle this, we should acknowledge that in the compiler, it'll come up. But this kind of makes it a moot point in the sense that except for associated types, you can't observe it. So I'm trying to figure out, should I land this change, which creates more errors than the other version, strictly more errors, or should I try to do the default change, which could allow some code to type check that would be rejected here. Like there might be some cases where adding a default would your code doesn't actually rely on the value of that associated type, so a default would be okay. But I guess the other nice thing about this change, of course, is it's totally independent from specialization. Right? So maybe the answer would be that we, like you can see, making this change and revisiting.
Wait, this is depending. This is doing analysis based on the impulse. instead of the trait itself.
Sorry?
But what's can you clarify the difference between the thing you implemented and the thing we discussed?
The thing we discussed was basically if there is a din overlapping impl and the trait is din safe, then the items in the impl must be default, I guess, comes to that. And I like this, now that I write it like that, actually, yeah, I prefer this first formulation because it doesn't put any limitations on the set of impls you can have if you are not din safe. Like if you don't care whether the trait is din safe or not, it doesn't make any difference to you. Whereas the second version does affect you unless, like it sort of, this version works better if we're going to opt in to saying that the trait should be din safe, then it makes sense to me, because then you can have restrictions that come as a result of that. In other words, does that make sense what I'm saying? Like if you write an impl like this.
Wait, but the way you have formulated the first one is doing analysis based. It sounds like it's determining properties of the trait by looking at the impls instead of determining properties of the impl by looking at the traits.
It looks at the set of impls, but the impls, notably, the impls it must be within the same crate due to coherence rules. But the overlapping impl has to be in the same crate as the trait that defines it, because it has to be defined over the self type has to be like a type parameter, which is only allowed in the same due to the orphan rules. So you can do this.
I feel this is sort of backwards reasoning, like
yeah. So I know why you're saying that. I don't disagree. Like you're saying that I think you have to. It makes you consider the din safety of the property not only of the trait declaration but also the impulse that exist for it. But on the other hand, it is probably the smallest. It's not the design I would start with, but it's probably the least breaking possible change that we could do in Rust 2015 to fix this problem, or 2018, in my mind. Well, so what I will do. So
and this doesn't treat. Okay, so associated constants are ruled out by the fact that they are not object safe, but if they would be.
Really, it's really associated non-functions.
Functions, yes.
And there's a slight. You could add a condition, which Taylor wanted, but I didn't. But that's not really that relevant.
Yeah,
so
I feel like the more conditions is added to this, the less I'm liking it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. The reason, there is a specific reason for that condition, but yeah. But I think the more important question is this first one of like, what is the overall strategy to take, or maybe how shall we decide?
I think it's premature to decide. But getting to a decision would be helped by listing the different alternatives and the create runs for them, so that when we have more information, we can decide.
That would be helped. I'm not sure. I'll think about it. I don't know. There's some probably worth investigating the implementation cost. If nothing else, it would be good to write up the patterns that work or don't work in each one. So.
We were writing at the same time.
That's true. All right, let's move on.
Moving on. There are no updates from the grammar working group, except there have been some meetings, it seems.
So for never type.
Right. So Aaron 1011 opened a PR 68350, which maybe you want to describe the mechanism, actually.
Basically, the idea is that so if you identify those type variables which fall back to never, you can look for cases where those type variables appeared in the return type of a function, but the parameter type, but not any of the parameters, essentially. In particular, the parameters don't have never type. So the intuition is, if you have a function like this, function foo of t takes a t, gives back a t, and you call foo with something of never type, then you can be sure that foo never actually executes. But if you have a function like so, and you call it, and it turns out to get inferred to have never type, which can happen through various means, I don't know, whatever. That was the whole point. That's the whole unsoundness. Then this is like potentially, if this call were to actually execute, it may actually return, in which case it would produce a value of never type, and that's the condition we want to avoid. And that's basically all the examples. I think this is sound in the sense that any potential problem would be caught by this lint. It's conservative in that there are safe patterns. There are reasonable and correct code that also gets caught by this. An obvious one would be something like this. When
you say takes a bang argument or exclamation argument, never argument, does that include things like, I'm assuming that doesn't include things like functions that a higher order function that returns exclamation or returns never? Because it's not sound then, right?
I don't know exactly how they implemented it, but yeah, presumably it means they have to take a not just a never argument, but an argument of uninhabited type.
Right, okay, and then the point is,
a function that returns never is inhabited. So
you're trying to prove that this function can never actually execute in any sense, that they can't instantiated types.
You're looking for functions that are returning uninhabited types, but don't take them as argument, and specifically not any uninhabited type, but uninhabited types that you choose to be uninhabited by fallback. Right. So like a function that's just declared to return, that's not a problem because it's hard-coded, but it's these functions where the caller had to select the return type and they selected, that's a problem. But it's not, well, actually, I can look at exactly how they coded it, because what I just said is a little different than, like this example, I think would trigger in their analysis, because I think they only look for a return type that includes never. But an alternative might be to look for a return type that is, well, yeah, I think I was going to say an alternative might be to look for a return type that is uninhabited, which would not include this case, but I think that doesn't catch some of the dangerous things. In specific, there's one where it's sort of, I think the pattern that occurred in the Objective-C crate was something like this. Anyway, I have to look. But the although no, because then there's another call. So what's happening here is you're returning a function which you're getting by transmuting something. And
I thought they had the Objective-C thingy in a regression test. Yes.
I'm sure they catch that case, but I'm wondering if they can have a more narrow test, is what I'm saying. That it still catches that case, and I think they can. Or maybe I misunderstood. I'll have to review what the PR exactly does. I don't remember. But
I think it seems good overall. But then there's the separate question of how we are going to roll this out.
Right. I was going to say, I think it seems good. I think there might be, the original approach might also be good, but this it's sort of, I thought,
making it
assume we find reasonably narrow. I guess it matters.
Like,
how narrow it is matters. But
like adding it, making it a permanent error in the spec.
So, right. So the next question is, let's assume we have this lint that is reasonably narrow, doesn't have too many false regressions. False, what's the better term people use instead of false positive? False lints, I guess. Aaron was pointing out that we would, unlike other lints, or this might not be a time-limited thing because you never know sort of when somebody had old code that they are dusting off. I don't know if I totally buy that argument.
I think the probability decreases with time.
Right. There was some. I guess the alternative. You could make it a hard error. I don't think anybody really wants that.
No, I definitely don't want that.
I feel like that's too complex and it would require a very strong, like we have to be really sure that it doesn't have false positives. We might be able to make it deny by default to start.
So my proposal, so a while back I wrote up a minimum lint levels infrastructure, which we could reuse here. So with the deduplication that Petruchenko proposed. So Aaron could take my PR and forward it. And in this case, it wouldn't be a future compatibility warning because we don't intend to make it a hard error, but it would effectively be the equivalent of using a hard-coded warning, but it would also be, you could also, so if you would use deny warnings in your crate, then it wouldn't compile.
All right, so let's back up. So the concern is somebody might have allow warnings and they won't see this warning. Is that the specific concern?
Yeah, then they would see the one because this ignores the, like, this is I think the strongest thing you can do without making it a hard error, which I think Aaron was in favor of a stronger approach that would force the user to acknowledge the problem, to see the problem, and this is the strongest I can think of without making it a hard error. We could also hard code a warning not to use a lint, or we could use a normal lint. Those are the options I can think of. So error, either it could be an error, or we could use minimum lint levels, or we could hard code a warning, or we could use a normal lint.
Or we can tie it to an addition.
Sorry?
Or we can tie it to an addition.
Yeah.
And we had this discussion already, and I'm not sure I want to reopen it, but
yeah, me either.
Except that I'm not sure I like the conclusion we reached either. But yeah, so.
But that would mean that we could only land the nether type in the new edition as well. That's I
mean, I don't like the idea of an unsilenceable warning that we don't, unless we.
So I'm okay with. I don't feel strongly that it must use the because this is not intended to be an error, that we should use an unsilenceable warning and stuff. But I'm I think Aaron's opinion is that we should use a stronger uh, mechanism, and but I don't want that to be an error, basically. But if you feel like a warning would be a normal lint or warning would be fine, I would be happy with that. Boats is not here, but well,
I guess I want to mull it over. I would like to see the results of
yeah.
if we have I would like to know how the creator results, but also the kinds of patterns.
I was hoping that creator would have finished by now, but unfortunately it's still at 23%. We'll have to wait.
All right, why don't we revisit this when we have creator data?
Okay.
Just to understand this, it sounds like the proposal is effectively that if you are being inferred to a generic type because you had an input of a generic type, then we wouldn't use the fallback to never. But if you are generating a never type explicitly, then you would have the fallback available to you, and we're tying that type inference to whether your never came from a never you were given or not?
Not exactly. The inference is not affected. The inference occurs the same no matter what. The question is, when do we warn you about that? So we're going to issue a lint if you had a type variable that we defaulted to never because of fallback, and that type variable appeared as the return value of a function that
but if you look at the very first file in the diff in the PR, it changes make diverging defaults to unconditionally use the never type. Otherwise, the limbs won't trigger.
Sorry, what I meant was not that the PR doesn't affect inference, although I think that's an independent part of the PR that we could tweak. But it doesn't make inference dependent on the inference doesn't depend on the signature of functions that you call in any new way.
Oh yeah.
That's only relevant whether the lint is issued.
Right, but it's right. But that's probably important. So we would need to land the inference change to actually have the lint be triggered.
The way it's implemented now, I think that's true, but I suspect it could be done differently.
Possibly. 25 minutes. Let's move on, I think.
Yeah.
So we have nothing new on the PI issues. We just discussed the never type regressions. I'll leave a note to revisit next week. Do we want to discuss the negative impulse? As I said in the pre-triage, I haven't reviewed your comments yet.
We could discuss. Well, what else is there down below? Not much.
Maybe we should go through them first.
There's the unsafe function. Why don't we do a negative impulse for 5 to 10 minutes? So till.
Yeah.
Would be good.
The only thing, and so since I haven't read the things you said,
right. I can summarize the result for you if you like.
Okay.
So for everyone else, Central raised 2 points about negative impulse. So you remember we have this idea to, at least in an unstable way, permit a negative impulse and then use it to close the unsoundness hole. Central pointed out 2 things. First of all, we have this notion of marker traits that allow you to skip. If you declare a marker trait, it can have no items, and you can have overlapping impulse for it. This is permitted with a feature gate today. And the idea of it is basically, it's like a poor man's special function. there's nothing to specialize. It doesn't really matter if you. But today, at least, they still have to obey the orphan requirements, which means that they can't implement foo for somebody else's type. However, it has been proposed in an issue, the name of 67919, that we could, in theory, lift that, and we could allow you to just implement marker traits for anybody, anywhere. But if we did that, that doesn't play well with negative impulse, because then you could, in principle, implement negative impulse for anybody, anywhere, and thus two, cousin crates could both. One could implement foo for somebody else's type, and one could implement not foo, and that would be bad. And this is correct. That would be bad. I think there are sort of, my comment was basically there are two options, but the underlying concept is that we have to have some notion. I called it ownership of an impl, but I think there's a better name for it: exclusive rights to an impl. The idea being you can only add negative impulse if you have exclusive rights to the impulse for that type, and those are tied to the orphan rules. The only way you get exclusive rights either by initially adding the trait in the first version, because nobody else has the trait, or because of the orphan rules. So that's the concept.
Right. I think if I remember correctly, I noted that one way we could get around the problem was that we couldn't. The orphan rules would still apply for negative impulse. That is. I think that's the same thing you are describing.
No, you can't apply the orphan rules for negative. Sorry, orphan rules do apply to negative impulse, first of all, in the PR, like all negative impulse. But
right, but I'm saying, like, if you lift those restrictions on the marker traits, you could still leave them in place for negative impulse on the marker traits.
But that doesn't suffice, because now I could publish a marker trait. You could add it for my type, and then I could later implement a negative trait on my own type. And like, the point is, you only can add negative impulse to something that you have exclusive rights to. And if we allow markers to disobey orphan rules, then nobody has exclusive rights to marker impulse. Anybody can add them, so nobody can add negative impulse, except for in the first release of the trait or a struct. Essentially, what I'm saying is there's a conflict here, and I think there's an underlying concept that is tied to SEMVer about when you can and cannot add things, and we can resolve it in a few ways. It's not a blocking concern in my view, but it is a thing to be resolved. I would personally just keep the orphan rules uniform, I think. But
I think I need to review this more in depth.
Is it so bad for adding a negative impl to be a breaking change?
Yes, absolutely bad. But it wouldn't be under any. It's not a breaking change under the proposals that are pending before us. I mean,
I know the one you just said it would have been. That's all.
It would be. You could make it a breaking change just for markers. That if we allowed marker traits to ignore coherence rules, then it would mean that yes, it's a breaking change for marker traits.
I think we don't want it to be a breaking change, because if we ever wanted to make copy, which is in a module called marker, an actual marker trait, then letting people say, no, my type is never going to be copy is a perfectly reasonable thing for them to do.
That's the reason I wanted to rename the attribute.
That shouldn't be a, well, but copy is another trait with no behavior that has no methods, that whatever it's named, it could be that, it could have that behavior. And saying, no, my type is never copy is a thing that you could totally do.
Just to be clear, why it would be bad, Felix, is if, in general, if I have the current state is that if you haven't implemented it yet, you might choose to in the future, and people can't have negative, we also prevent people from assuming you didn't, right? And so we want you to be able to explicitly, to leave your mind undecided for a couple of releases and then explicitly decide yes or no. I will implement or I will not implement this trait. And at that point, it's fixed. And I think that's the model you want. You don't want everyone to have to decide up front what they do and do not implement.
So I think that there is value in being able to implement microtraits. At least, I had a specific concrete use case for it in Rust C, and I was like, why can't I do this? I assumed I could do this, and I was surprised I couldn't, because I wanted to move some code around to improve compile times for the compiler.
Right.
So.
I guess I'm not opposed. I think it's just going to be a question of there's no fundamental problem as long as we base the December rules on this sort of exclusive rights idea, but it's just a question of how complex it becomes for people to understand it. On the other hand, I think the orphan rules are, limiting, and it might be worth trying to open them in certain ways.
Right.
I feel like that's an orthogonal concern. That's kind of my feeling.
And we can certainly remove the orphan restriction on them later if necessary, right?
Yeah, we could. It's just at that point, December rules for negative impulse change.
Yes.
But
only for marker traits which aren't yet stable.
I
as
guess,
long as we did that as part of the marker release, we'd be okay.
That's right. The other question was around const, and there I basically feel like a negative impulse says there will be no impl at all. So that would mean that adding a const impl is also illegal.
Yeah, that was more like confirming something I expected.
All right, well, you go ahead and read the write-up. Maybe it was ambitious to try to cover that here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just didn't have enough time to get to it.
Oopsie. So shall we use the little time to talk about the unsafe nominated RFC?
I think so.
I just made
the inference stuff went into FTP like a few seconds ago.
So there's this RFC, it's kind of old, from Ralph, which basically has the goal of saying, currently today, an unsafe function is allowed to do unsafe things, but that's sort of that means that you can't tell exactly which actions are unsafe in the body, which for people like me who like to leave comments on every call to an unsafe function, for example, explaining why that call is okay, that becomes harder to do because you don't have any sort of indication that a function is unsafe. Like you can't say I attached every unsafe block. So what Ralph proposes,
or dereference or something as well.
Or dereferences and so on. What Ralph proposes is that the end goal is to make it so that an unsafe function does not imply that its body can do unsafe things without an additional unsafe block. I think this becomes a little bit clearer if you have that. There has been some observation, right, that unsafe on a block is really saying this block is trusted, and unsafe on a function really saying that this is unsafe. And so if you took that approach, then it's just saying that unsafe functions don't imply trusted bodies, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. But there would be different ways to phase this in. It could just be a warning. It could be that we use the addition. It could be a warning in 2018, and if we do an addition, it becomes a hard error. It could be, Josh had some other ideas that we were discussing when we entered the call of introducing a form of keyword or something.
Or some other syntax to distinguish this is unsafe to call and its body is unsafe from this is unsafe to call, but its entire body is not necessarily unsafe. I did have one thought on this, by the way, that I didn't have earlier. Would it be reasonable to say that if you have a function that is unsafe in this new model, where the body is not inherently unsafe, but in the body you don't call a single unsafe function or otherwise have a single unsafe block, then the function probably shouldn't be unsafe? I mean, I think what we're arguing here is you're probably still going to need an unsafe block in the function. You just don't necessarily need the entire function to be an unsafe block.
Well, setlen has no unsafe coding in its.
I think that would make more sense if we did something like the unsafe fields proposal from back in the day.
You are entirely right. Invariants are the case where this is not true, that if you modify a field that is relied upon by other unsafe code, then you are doing something potentially unsafe, even though your body is not actually wanting to have unrestricted access to unsafe code. Okay, I withdraw that comment, and that is a perfect example of why. Thank you.
I do think what you said made me remember that, I mean, I think there is a larger, well, this would be quite compatible with something like unsafe fields. I don't know that they're not particularly entangled, except that I think the way we write unsafe code, especially around unsafe code guidelines, is probably going to want to evolve over time. And I don't think we have to figure all that out in order to accept this RC, but I do think it'd be interesting if we found the right person to consider like trying to make those sets of changes together.
With respect to addition changes, this would be quite easy, I think, to implement and reliable, and it would be quite reliable. You just add an unsafe block to all unsafe functions, and then the user can migrate over time to make the code idiomatic.
Well, I can already hear the people complaining that all their code got indented an extra 4 spaces through that.
Yeah, there has been some complaints around that on the RC. I have a specific solution in mind for that. So
a suggestion that I don't know if I put it forward or someone else did, but I know Ralph was okay with it once I explained it, was to use an attribute on a function that it's unsafe, so that the unsafe keyword would still mean this function is unsafe and its body is implicitly unsafe. But if you use hash open bracket unsafe close bracket, then
the unsafe that doesn't work.
What doesn't work about that?
It's a keyword, so you can't use it in that.
Oh well, okay then. All right, that seems like a technical difficulty. Well, or even just it seems like that's something you can work around. I would imagine. I don't know enough about the current parser to say how hard it is to do. But
I will have to look.
We can say that keyword is allowed in that position, for example. But I guess I feel like this seems. I'm not a big fan of having 2 ways.
I think I really like Josh's idea. If we could get out of the invariant problem there, because then you could make the, hey, did you know you don't have any unsafe blocks in your unsafe function as like a Clippy style choice? And if we did get into the world where, you know, your function's unsafe, but you don't have any unsafe blocks, I think you probably meant to do something different there. And if we made that a plausible warning that could be opted into or on by default or something like that, then that sounds pretty interesting, Josh, actually.
Could you write down your idea? I'm not fully sure I understood it.
I think it's that you could have warnings, right?
It was effectively, yes, that you could have some manner of warning or lint that tells you that you have an unsafe block, but you have an unsafe function, but nothing in it needs unsafe. So I was kind of asking, is there a reason why you'd want that? I do think that in order to have that, you'd have to have the concept of unsafe fields or similar, but.
So can I ask a question, Felix? The motivation for the attribute, is it to avoid breaking people's code, or is it just to give people the ability to not indent?
It's a mix of things. It does avoid breaking people's code. Also, I mean, Ralph was concerned at one point that, using an attribute. One thing that's interesting about this is that it's something where using this attribute doesn't on its own like inject unsoundness. You have to be doing something else somewhere else to actually make something unsound. So it's one of those things where it sort of carries the sort of weight of this thing, that it's not actually something that on its own can make your code unsound. It's more of a marker that you're saying something is going on and this function does something somewhere else or someone in its control flow that you need to be aware of.
It is, as a side note, a little unfortunate that when we did a giant pile of reserved keywords in Rust that we didn't use yet but might in the future, that one of those was not safe, because it would perhaps be nice at a minimum for transition purposes to be able to encourage people to write a safe block inside their unsafe function.
I think the argument around,
We could reserve that for the next edition, right?
We could. I think at this point it might be a moot point. I just was bringing it up that if we had that keyword handy, I could see a use for it here.
I think the argument around indentation feels a little weak to me. Like, if you put unsafe in a relatively targeted way around the actual unsafe operations, then, which we could also.
Great.
Yeah, no, it's the Rust
wouldn't be that
fix
hard to
thing
do
that's
that in our
the
lint.
problem there.
I think the concern is around like people who have to write lots of one person on the RT thread is making the point that if you write a lot of FFI centric code, you write a lot of unsafe functions, and that's going to add a lot of noise, specifically small ones. So I think the right word drift argument makes sense.
I can definitely.
But I have a neat solution to that also fits with other things.
Josh, you were about to say something?
I was just going to say that I absolutely sympathize with that. That on the one hand, I do very much favor the idea of let's not have people accidentally use unsafe without a warning inside a function that was only marked unsafe because its interface is unsafe. And at the same time, I do completely understand that if you are writing a pile of functions, all of which are going to be short and entirely unsafe, that it would be additional syntactic noise to have to write, unsafe fun that has unsafe in it. And I would like there to be an easier way to do that. This is actually one other argument potentially in favor of being able to write this interface is unsafe, but this body is not, as a separate concept from this interface and body are unsafe as a shorthand.
Yeah, I just point out that a procedural macro might also address this.
It potentially could, yes.
Seems like a relatively narrow situation to me, but
Yeah.
For that matter,
Yeah,
things like Bindgen could relatively easily handle that.
So I have a suggestion which would, I think, solve most of the problems with right-word drift, and that is that you could write equals and then make an expression to the right. And I think that this would both unify the grammar and simplify the parser around it, would make also have the benefits of encouraging smaller functions.
yeah, I've been a fan of this. I was going to bring that up too.
I've actually, so I'm quite sure it would simplify the actual grammar and the parsing, at least when I looked at the implementation.
Yeah, so I'm sort of ambivalent on that one because C# added that, and it's my experience with it has sort of been that now there's just a big style debate over, oh, but clearly no, you should just put braces, or oh no, you shouldn't have it on one line, or Rust would be a little better because it doesn't have the statement problem the same way, but then you end up with the like, oh, but I needed to introduce a let and now it's not an equals anymore, or etc.
I think we do have, I mean, sometimes if you make some changes, that happens with Rust FMT, that it does introduce blocks and whatnot. Like that happens if you were writing a match and now suddenly you need to bind something in one of the arms that will add a block and stuff.
That's fair. But at the same time, I would also say, while I am not necessarily expressing a general preference for syntactic salt in other cases, I think there's value in the fact that unsafe always has braces associated with it.
But it would here too, right?
Yeah, it does there.
I just mean it is not subtle. This is potentially a more subtle way of introducing unsafe that at a glance, it's not quite as obvious that it's part of the declaration.
But it's not part of the declaration because it's in the body, right?
Right.
I'm confused.
I think I'm confused.
So when you say unsafe fn foo and the arguments equals unsafe, so that the body is to the right hand side of the equals, and it's an expression. So it's not part of the signature.
That's not what I'm referring to. I'm saying that the formatting I have seen for such proposals tends to put the equals unsafe brace in a place where it's easy to gloss over it and just see brace.
Doesn't that depend on like the length of, like if you have something that is very long, like horizontally long, the Rust differently will break will have rules for breaking the line and indenting things. But if it's short, it won't.
What I'm suggesting is very specifically that if you write unsafe, then unsafe is the very first thing you write, and you very much see it at the beginning of the function. If you put unsafe in the middle of the declaration, basically after a big pile of types that somebody might be slightly glossing over because they're getting to the body of the function, and before the curly brace that normally indicates start paying attention to code here, then I feel that it could more easily get lost. I do in general appreciate the whole like shorter syntax for a short function concept, but I think
just don't want it to be applied to unsafe.
I'm not necessarily even saying that. I'm saying that a style perspective, this feels like a good way to miss that there's an unsafe.
Okay. Could you tweak that by, for example, recognizing that this is unsafe and shortening, like using different thresholds and stuff?
Effectively formatting differences such that it always ended up on a line by itself, so it was hard to miss.
Specifically for unsafe.
That would help, certainly.
This feels like the same thing as const in a C++ member function, so we could presumably get some experience from C++ people about how much people get used to looking for that, although of course const is not nearly as impactful as unsafe.
Right, that would be my concern, yes. I don't think this is something we can settle in the next 10 minutes. I'm just making the observation that I don't want unsafe to appear somewhere that it's easily missed. At the beginning, it's not easily missed. In a block that then has to be indented is also not easily missed. And even the proposal of like open brace, unsafe, open brace on the line where you'd normally put open brace to reduce indentation is still a little harder to miss because brace tends to be one of the visual signals you're looking for the start of a body of a function. So it at least is a slight improvement over, to me, equal sign, unsafe, open brace. But again, we're bike shedding syntax at this point.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of turn us and
back. Yeah.
But I did want to raise up, it seems like we kind of had this cluster of interrelated proposals. Is this like that complement one another or something? That I don't know. How do we want to consider proceeding here? It didn't feel like we were necessarily ready to move on. any one
I think fighting the right word drift is a legitimate concern, but I feel like it's more important, even if we don't do that change to add equals expression. I think this is still a good idea. So I would personally like to move forward with the RFC as proposed, and so we would undo the current links that exists in the opposite direction, and then we would start with a warning and then we would do an addition change, where we would make it an error, which shouldn't be very hard.
I think it's
Margin
worth
as well.
observing, by the way, the fact that we have a lint today that steers people in the opposite direction is something that we should take into account when considering how quickly we should make a change like this. It is, for want of a better description, it's the kind of thing that makes for poor optics and PR if we make people feel like we push them in one direction and then we push them back in the other direction, causing more work for them. So at a minimum, if we're thinking we might be in favor of this, we should consider dropping that lint now and potentially introducing, for example, a allow by default lint that allows you to opt into explicitly putting an unsafe block inside your unsafe bin.
I think that's a very good idea.
I think doing that should be reasonably uncontroversial, because then you're just giving people a tool they can use to write cleaner, unsafe code that may be less error prone. Then we could debate at some future time if and when we might wish to make that lint into a warning. But
So you were saying, that for,
go ahead.
so you're saying for now we would not go ahead and merge the RFC, but we would remove the current lint and add a lint in the opposite direction, which would be allow by default. Is that a good summary?
That's what so I'm proposing that, yes, that's correct. I am still in favor of the RFC, but I'm also in favor of taking our time on the RFC. And frankly, I would not be opposed to, let's wait a year and then reconsider whether people are opting into that lint.
So Nico made the, if some of you have seen the roadmap RFC, Nico meant the core team, and Nico, as part of the core team, made the suggestion that we would decide in October whether we would have a new edition. So we would need to be and to make the preparations for them by then. So we would need to do that by then, which is less than a year. So that's something to keep in mind.
2021 edition, yeah. Seems okay. I think removing the lint is an obvious step that we should take. I personally would be okay with landing the RFC also. We don't have to finalize it necessarily. I mean, we don't have to stabilize it necessarily, but well, let me rephrase that. I would be in favor of landing the RFC because I'd like to start, but not if we're hesitant about whether we're going to do it. I think we should only land it if we're going to do it.
So there seems to be consensus around dropping the lint and adding a lint in the opposite direction. I can follow up with that to make make the necessary.
One thing I might is that.
One sec.
Go on.
So I was going to ask: is there anyone who is opposed to merging the RFC at the moment?
I would say I'm absolutely in favor of letting people have the option of being more explicit about their unsafe here. I'm not sure that I'm convinced in the value of forcing it.
Okay.
So you would be in favor of giving people the option of such a lint, and you're just uncertain at this time about the value of potentially ever making that lint a warning by default?
I could potentially even say, I just wouldn't want to say that. I believe this is more of a style choice, and we can push people in the direction of a better style choice. But if people are writing a bunch of, I have a bunch of functions that take a lot of pointers and call a lot of copy non-overlappings and stuff like that,
right.
I'm not sure how valuable this always is.
So you're saying that you were not sure whether you want to make it a hard error at some point yet, but a warning would be fine.
I'm absolutely in favor of letting people say, I want to be more focused in this, and maybe even making that the default.
I would be pretty okay with a compromise that says, well, add a lint, it'll be warned by default maybe. And if we ever want to turn it, we could make it deny by default, and it's not even a breaking change, technically speaking. I wouldn't do it lightly. And I don't really care that much if we make the addition deadline. So I'm trying to say, because I think we can do all the migration, all the things as a lint, and it's just fine.
To clarify something, I think
good.
the initial proposal is to start with allow by default, precisely because we don't necessarily want to go directly from we recommend against this to we recommend for this without an intervening period of we're not going to complain at you.
Let me be clear.
Right.
I think that making a lint that warns by default should have an RFC.
Okay.
Because I think it's a major user visible change.
Okay.
But
I was trying to make sure.
I could imagine retooling the RFC to just say that we're going to add a lint that warns by default. And
Yeah, in terms of style, I do agree that like we regularly see people in FFI heavy code doing things like opting out of the style lints for naming conventions because they need to reference a pile of things that are, not following Rust's naming conventions because they're an external library. And at the same time, it's good that those are the default naming conventions. This is the same kind of thing of people could choose, even if we made this a warning or even someday a deny, people could choose to opt out of that if they are writing a ton of unsafe one-liner functions that need to go call some other FFI function and they don't want the noise of unsafe.
let me add one other statement.
So with
automated Rust fix.
So with 1 minute to go, I think the actionable conclusion from this meeting right now is that we will change the lint, so the existing lint, so that it doesn't complain about unsafe blocks and unsafe functions, and that we will add an allow by default lint in the inverse direction.
Yes, and I think we should have a comment that summarizes some of these notes. I can write it.
I can take care of the allow by default stuff. Maybe you can leave a comment about.
I'll write a comment. I feel like I have a feeling. Capture some of them.
I will make a separate issue or PR for the existing lints.
All right.
We can share some of that work.
So, everyone agrees on these resolved items? You guys have it? Aye. Okay.
Nice.
All right. See you all later.
See ya. Thanks.
Bye.